I've watched politics collide with economics for years, but this one is different because the payback didn't come from a government office. It came from ordinary people, quietly, consistently, and it landed exactly where it hurts most, the industries that thought they were untouchable. When you weaponize trade talk, when you treat allies like punching bags, you don't just create headlines, you create habits. And once consumer habits flip, you don't just win them back with a press conference. Now here's the twist. The ripple isn't hitting some abstract number on a chart. It's hitting real towns, real paychecks, real workers, especially in Kentucky, where a signature industry is suddenly staring at a very ugly reality. So what actually happened? Why did Canada push back this way? And why is Kentucky feeling the sharpest edge of it? This story starts the way a lot of political messes start, with talk that sounds tough on a microphone and reckless when it meets the real world. Over the past year, the public back and forth between Trump and Canada didn't just stay in the realm of speeches and social media, it spilled into something far more dangerous for any economy: confidence. Because trade isn't just containers crossing a border. Trade is trust, built over decades, broken in days. And when trust breaks, people don't always wait for formal policy. They act on instinct, they adjust, they avoid, they substitute, they move on. That's the part so many political strategists consistently underestimate. Consumers aren't machines. They're not obligated to keep buying your products just because that's how it used to be. If they feel insulted, targeted, or disrespected, they don't need a law to change what they put in their cart. They just do it. And Canada, whether you agree with their approach or not, has a long history of responding sharply when its sovereignty is treated like a joke. When rhetoric escalates into open disrespect, the reaction isn't always a negotiation. Sometimes it's a cultural reflex. Fine, we'll take our money elsewhere. Now here's where this becomes painfully specific. If you want to hit the United States in a way that's visible, emotional, and economically meaningful, you don't start with some niche component most people have never heard of. You target products that have identity, products that signal America, products that are deeply tied to political donor networks, brand legacy, and local jobs. That's why Kentucky ends up in the blast radius. Because Kentucky isn't just a state. In the global marketplace, Kentucky is a symbol, bourbon country, a product category that's been marketed for generations as heritage, pride, and tradition, and that symbolism cuts both ways. When a symbol is rejected, the rejection is loud even if nobody is shouting. Let's be careful with one thing. Industries rise and fall for lots of reasons. Demand shifts, warehouses fill up, younger consumers change what they drink, inflation changes spending. All of that can be true at the same time, but that's exactly why this moment is so brutal. When an industry is already juggling normal market pressures, it becomes far more vulnerable to a sudden external shock, like a rapid drop in a major export market or a social wave that pushes buyers toward alternatives. And alternatives are the real killer, because once a bartender swaps a default bottle for something else and the customer shrugs and says, honestly, this is fine, a habit is broken. And broken habits don't magically repair themselves. Brands spend decades turning their product into a reflex. The entire goal is to make you reach without thinking. But when the reach stops, the brand learns a terrifying truth. Loyalty is often just convenience in a nice suit. This is what turning the tables looks like in modern economics. Not a dramatic embargo, not a cinematic government showdown, a slow, disciplined shift in behavior, millions of micro decisions that add up to a very macro consequence. Now imagine you're running a bourbon operation in Kentucky. Your timelines are long, your inventory decisions were made years ago, your barrels are aging, your logistics are built on predictable flows. If demand suddenly cools faster than you can adjust, you can't just snap your fingers and fix it. You're stuck with product moving through a pipeline that doesn't care about politics and doesn't care about press releases. And this is where the price part hits, because the people who feel it first are almost never the people who cause the mess. The workers, the bottling lines, the warehouse crews, the truck drivers, the small businesses that depend on distillery traffic, the local diners that serve lunch to shift workers, the entire ecosystem that lives around one proud industry. And then you get the ugliest part of political economics, the blame game. Companies point to market conditions. Politicians point to the other side. Commentators pick their team and shout. But families don't pay bills with shouting. Communities don't survive on talking points. Kentucky's pain in this story is the warning label on a bigger bottle. When leaders treat global relationships like a stage prop, local workers end up eating the consequences. So the big question becomes, was this outcome inevitable, or was it completely predictable? Because the next part of the story is where the strategy becomes obvious, how a consumer backlash can be aimed like a laser, and why the political figures who should have defended their own state suddenly went quiet when the pressure landed. Here's where the silence becomes louder than the outrage. When the pressure started building, when early warning signs were already flashing, you would expect political leaders, especially those representing affected states, to step in, to de-escalate, to correct course, to protect their own constituents. Instead, what followed was a vacuum. No urgent statements, no public pushback, no visible effort to calm relations or acknowledge the risk. And that absence matters because markets don't wait for courage. They respond to signals. And silence, in moments like this, is a signal. For consumers watching from the outside, it looked like approval, or at least indifference. If leaders weren't pushing back, why should ordinary people hold back? This is the political blind spot that turns a manageable dispute into a structural crisis. When nobody with authority says, "Stop, this is going too far," the momentum keeps rolling forward on its own. Now, here's something critical to understand about consumer-driven backlash. It doesn't spread evenly. It concentrates. It looks for pressure points. Canada didn't need to hurt every American industry. That would have been inefficient and unfocused. Instead, consumer attention narrowed onto industries that were both symbolic and politically connected, products that represented Made in America pride, industries that had historically aligned themselves with aggressive political messaging, brands that were visible, recognizable, and easy to substitute. Bourbon fit that profile perfectly, and once that connection snapped into focus, the reaction hardened. Because consumers don't just buy products, they buy stories. And suddenly the story around American bourbon wasn't just about flavor or tradition. It became tied to behavior, attitude, and values. That's when something very important happened. The narrative flipped. Instead of Canada being framed as the weaker side in a power struggle, American producers started looking exposed, defensive, reactive, issuing explanations that didn't fully line up with what people were seeing on the ground. You could hear it in the language: temporary adjustments, inventory corrections, long-term planning. But those phrases don't reassure workers facing uncertainty. They don't reassure distributors watching orders slow. And they don't convince consumers who already made a moral decision and moved on. Because here's the brutal truth about consumer boycotts. Once they become habitual, they stop feeling like a protest. They just become normal behavior. At first, people say, "I'm choosing this instead of that." 6 months later, they say, "This is what I drink." And that shift is devastating for industries built on long cycles and brand loyalty. Now zoom out for a moment. This wasn't just about one product or one country. It exposed a deeper flaw in how political power has been exercised for years: the belief that economic dominance guarantees compliance. That logic assumes everyone values access the same way. It assumes partners will tolerate disrespect if the market is big enough. It assumes pride is negotiable, but pride isn't negotiable, and neither is agency. Canada didn't need to win a negotiation to push back. It simply needed millions of people to agree quietly that they had other options. And in a modern economy, options are power. That's the part so many political strategies fail to account for. The global economy today isn't just a map of governments and treaties. It's a web of preferences, habits, and reputational signals. Once a reputation shifts from trusted partner to unreliable bully, no tariff adjustment can fully undo that damage. And that damage doesn't stop at the border. Because back in Kentucky, the consequences don't arrive as headlines. They arrive as delayed shifts, paused expansions, hiring freezes, reduced overtime, quiet conversations about next year. This is how economic pain actually spreads, not in dramatic crashes, but in slow contractions that hollow out communities over time. And the most frustrating part? The people absorbing this shock had no seat at the table when the conflict was created. They didn't draft speeches, they didn't escalate rhetoric, they didn't benefit politically from confrontation. They simply built an industry that depended on stability and watched stability get treated like a disposable luxury, which raises an uncomfortable question. If leadership means responsibility, where was the responsibility when the risk was obvious? Because what happened next makes one thing clear: this wasn't just an economic miscalculation, it was a failure of accountability. And in the next part, we need to talk about how this kind of damage doesn't stay contained, how it ripples outward, reshaping entire regional economies, and why recovering from it is far harder than anyone wants to admit. This is the point where the damage stops being theoretical and starts becoming irreversible. Because once an industry loses a major market, it doesn't just lose revenue, it loses leverage. And leverage is what allows companies to weather storms, invest through downturns, and protect workers when demand softens. When that leverage disappears, everything downstream tightens. Producers cut back production plans, distributors reduce orders, suppliers feel the slowdown, and workers, always last in line for protection, feel it first. What makes this moment especially dangerous for Kentucky's bourbon industry is timing. Bourbon isn't fast-moving inventory. You can't just pivot overnight. Barrels are filled years in advance. Aging schedules are fixed. Capital is locked up in product that assumes future demand will exist. That assumption is now cracked, and once that crack forms, the entire business model starts to wobble. Because bourbon isn't just liquid in a bottle, it's an asset class. Aging barrels are supposed to gain value over time. They're used to secure loans, justify expansions, and signal long-term stability to investors. But that system only works if there's confidence that buyers will still be there when the whiskey is ready. When confidence collapses, barrels stop looking like assets and start looking like risk. That's when lenders get cautious. That's when credit tightens. That's when temporary setbacks quietly turn into permanent closures. And here's the part many people miss. Even if demand eventually returns, it doesn't return evenly. Big brands may survive by absorbing losses, diversifying markets, or outlasting competitors. Smaller producers don't have that luxury. They live closer to the edge. One bad year isn't a setback, it's an existential threat. This is how consolidation accelerates. This is how local identity gets replaced by corporate survival logic. This is how heritage industries lose the very character they were built on. Now contrast that with what's happening north of the border. While American producers scramble to explain downturns, Canadian consumers are discovering alternatives, not out of necessity, but out of curiosity. And curiosity is sticky. Bars adjust menus, retailers adjust shelf space, distributors renegotiate contracts. Once those systems shift, reversing them isn't just a matter of politics, it's logistics, it's relationships, it's economics, and that's what makes this situation so different from traditional trade disputes. There's no single lever to pull to fix it. You can't order consumers to go back. You can't legislate brand loyalty. You can't bully trust into existence. Trust has to be rebuilt slowly, and sometimes it never fully returns. This is why trade experts have warned for decades that reputational damage is the most expensive kind of damage. It lingers long after headlines fade. It reshapes assumptions. It alters default behavior. And that's exactly what's happening here. What began as aggressive rhetoric has evolved into a lesson in economic humility. A reminder that power doesn't flow only from size or strength, but from cooperation, predictability, and respect. The irony is hard to miss. The strategy was supposed to project dominance. Instead, it exposed fragility. The goal was to force compliance. Instead, it triggered independence. And the cost isn't being paid by decision makers. It's being paid by workers, families, and communities who built something real and watched it get pulled into a conflict they never asked for. Kentucky's experience isn't unique, it's just visible. Because bourbon is iconic, because it's symbolic, because its decline tells a story that spreadsheets alone can't. It shows what happens when politics ignores the human layer of economics, when leaders forget that markets are made of people, not pawns. And this raises the most uncomfortable question of all. If this kind of damage can happen to an industry this established, this culturally embedded, this globally recognized, what does that say about the vulnerability of everything else? Because in the next part, we need to look at the broader implications, what this means for future trade relationships, for America's credibility, and for the political system that allowed this to unfold without correction. This is where the story stops being just about Kentucky and starts becoming a warning for the entire system, because once a trading partner realizes that economic pressure doesn't have to come from governments, everything changes. The old rules, tariffs, negotiations, backroom deals, lose some of their power. Consumer choice becomes the leverage. And that shift should make policymakers deeply uncomfortable. Why? Because it's unpredictable. You can't control it. You can't spin it. And once it starts, it's incredibly hard to reverse. For decades, American economic strategy has rested on a simple assumption. Access to the U.S. market is so valuable that partners will tolerate almost anything to keep it. That assumption worked when alternatives were limited and relationships were stable. But the world has changed. Supply chains are more flexible. Consumers are more informed. National identity matters more than technocrats expected. And when people feel disrespected, they're willing to accept inconvenience as a price of principle. Canada's response fits perfectly into this new reality. No dramatic announcements, no sweeping bans, just a cultural shift that spread organically. And because it didn't look like a formal attack, it was easy to underestimate, until the numbers started to show up where denial was no longer possible. This is the part of the story that political leaders often avoid discussing: credibility. In international trade, credibility is currency. When a country signals that its policies can swing wildly based on ego or impulse, partners start insulating themselves. They diversify suppliers, they build redundancy, they reduce exposure. And once that process starts, it doesn't stop just because the rhetoric cools down. That's the long-term cost playing out right now. Canada didn't just change what it buys, it changed how it thinks about reliance. And that mindset shift may outlast any single political figure or administration. Now look back at the American political response, or lack of one. When representatives stay silent while their own states absorb economic damage, it sends a clear message. Loyalty to power outranks accountability to people. That message doesn't go unnoticed. Not by voters, not by workers, and not by international partners. Because if leaders won't even defend their own constituents from foreseeable harm, why would anyone assume they'll honor long-term commitments abroad? This is where domestic politics and global economics collide in dangerous ways. Trust erodes internally and externally at the same time, and once trust erodes, rebuilding it requires more than speeches. It requires consistency, predictability, and above all, restraint. The contrast couldn't be sharper. On one side, a strategy built on pressure and bravado. On the other, a response built on coordination and patience. One side expected compliance, the other adjusted and moved on. And in that contrast lies the real lesson. Economic power isn't just about being big, it's about being reliable. The United States still has enormous economic influence, but influence only works when others believe engaging with you is worth the risk. When the risk becomes unpredictable, influence turns into liability. This moment should have triggered serious introspection within political leadership, a reassessment of how trade rhetoric translates into real-world consequences, a recognition that economic relationships aren't zero-sum games, they're ecosystems. But instead the pattern repeated: denial, deflection, and distraction. And while that happens, the damage compounds. Industries adapt, but often by shrinking. Workers adapt, but often by leaving. Communities adapt, but often by losing what made them distinctive. This is the quiet cost of political ego, not one catastrophic collapse, but thousands of individual decisions that collectively hollow out economic resilience. And this brings us to the final question, one that cuts through all the numbers, speeches, and blame shifting. Who actually pays when strategy fails? Because in the last part, we need to confront that answer directly and what it says about leadership, accountability, and the kind of economic future this path creates. This is where the story ends, but the consequences don't. Because when everything is stripped away, when the speeches fade and the numbers settle, the answer to who pays is painfully clear, not the people who made the decisions. They move on, they reframe, they fundraise, but the cost stays behind. It stays with the workers whose shifts disappear without warning, with the families recalculating budgets month by month, with towns built around a single industry now forced to imagine a future without it. Kentucky didn't vote for instability. It built something tangible, something admired worldwide, and yet it became collateral damage in a conflict driven by ego rather than strategy. That's the real tragedy here. Not that markets changed, but that the change was avoidable, because this wasn't a natural disaster. It wasn't a technological disruption. It wasn't an unavoidable global shock. It was a choice to escalate rhetoric without understanding consequences, a choice to treat allies as expendable, a choice to assume power meant immunity from pushback. And what Canada's response proved, quietly but decisively, is that no economy is immune to consumer sovereignty. Millions of ordinary people made ordinary choices, and those choices reshaped trade flows, market confidence, and political assumptions. That should terrify policymakers, not because consumers are hostile, but because they're autonomous. You can't command them. You can't threaten them. You can't bully them into loyalty. Once they decide, the system adjusts around them. This is why the recovery question is so uncomfortable. Because even if rhetoric softens, even if leadership changes, even if relations improve on paper, consumer habits don't reset on command. Some Canadian buyers may return, some won't. And the ones who don't set a precedent, alternatives exist and dependence isn't inevitable. That's a lesson other countries are watching closely. If Canada can absorb pressure and adapt, what about others? If consumers can coordinate without formal policy, what does that mean for future trade conflicts? If reputation damage is this costly, how much risk is leadership really willing to tolerate? These aren't abstract questions anymore. They're being tested in real time. And here's the cliffhanger no one wants to talk about. This isn't the end of the story. It's the beginning of a new phase. Because once consumer-driven resistance proves effective, it doesn't stay isolated. It becomes a model, a template, a signal. Other industries, other countries, other conflicts. The next confrontation won't look the same, but it will rhyme. And when it happens, the same question will surface again. Did leaders learn, or did they double down? Because economic power in the modern world doesn't just come from size. It comes from trust, restraint, and the ability to see 2 steps ahead. Right now, the evidence suggests those lessons are still being ignored. And if they are, Kentucky won't be the last place to pay the price. So here's the real takeaway, one worth sitting with. Markets remember, consumers remember, and consequences don't ask permission before arriving. If you want to understand how power actually works beyond slogans and headlines, stay with this channel. Subscribe for deep, clear analysis of economics, politics, and the real-world costs of leadership decisions. And tell me in the comments, do you think consumer power is becoming stronger than government power? Or is this just the beginning of something much bigger? Because the next chapter is already forming.